October 2023, upstate New York. The Avengers compound sat in ruins, under a sky choked with dust and smoke. What had been a fortress of hope now looked like the skeleton of a broken promise, its walls shattered by the barrage from Sanctuary 2, that still hung overhead like a mechanical vulture. Steve Rogers stood alone in the wasteland, shield strapped to his forearm, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. His uniform was torn, his breath came in ragged pulls, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest. But rest wasn't an option. Not when Thanos and his army stood 50 yards away, a tide of alien warriors and war machines that stretched to the horizon. The radio crackled. Sam's voice, warm and familiar, cut through the static.
On your left.
Steve turned. Behind him, golden sparks traced circles in the air. Portals. Dozens of them blooming like flowers made of light. Through the first stepped T'Challa Black Panther at the head of the Wakandan army. Through another came the Guardians. Then the Sorcerers, the Ravagers, the armies of Earth and beyond. And then one portal opened wrong. It wasn't the clean geometry of a sling ring gate. This one tore through reality with the sound of glass scraping stone, its edges flickering between gold and shadow wreathed in clouds that shouldn't exist in a battlefield. The air around it tasted metallic. Wrong. From that rift stepped a figure no larger than a child, but the weight of his presence hit the field like a shock wave. He wore armor that seemed both ancient and impossibly functional, dark fabric under plates that caught the light like bronze. In his hand, a staff red-tasseled and deceptively plain. His face was sharp, almost simian, with eyes that gleamed gold, and held the kind of boredom that came from watching empires rise and fall. He glanced around the battlefield the way someone might survey a county fair, casual, unimpressed.
So this is where they hold the auditions for godhood.
Peter Parker, crouched behind a chunk of rubble, with the gauntlet clutched to his chest, blinked.
New guy.
Doctor Strange stood 10 feet away, hands still glowing from the portal work. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had just made a very calculated gamble and wasn't sure yet if it would pay off.
Not new, a problem that might solve another problem.
The small figure Sun Wukong turned his gaze toward the distant figure of Thanos. The Titan stood at the center of his force's double-bladed sword resting against his shoulder, expression carved from stone. Around him, the Black Order waited like hunting dogs on a leash. Wukong tilted his head. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the field with unnatural clarity, as if the air itself wanted to listen.
Balance through genocide. How original. Sounds like the philosophy of someone too weak to build anything worth keeping.
Thanos didn't respond, but his eyes shifted, locked onto the newcomer. Calculating. Steve watched the Titan's jaw tighten just a fraction. That was the tell. Thanos saw what Strange saw, a variable, an unknown. Steve didn't have time for questions. He raised his shield.
Avengers.
The word hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then,
assemble.
The battlefield exploded into motion. Armies collided with the roar of a storm breaking. Alien war cries mixed with human shouts. Energy blasts painted the sky in streaks of blue and gold, and the ground shook with the impact of bodies and weapons and fury. Wukong didn't charge forward like the others. He watched for 3 seconds, staff resting against his shoulder, and then he moved. Not toward Thanos, toward the flow. A line of Chitauri chariots screamed toward the left flank, their riders howling. Wukong stepped into their path, didn't raise his weapon, just spun the staff once lazy, and the leading chariot's trajectory bent like light through water. It slammed into the one behind it. Then, the next. Within 5 seconds, a dozen vehicles had created a pileup of metal and bodies, their own momentum turned into a weapon against them. He grinned.
You don't need force, just the right angle.
A Leviathan, one of the massive serpentine war beasts, barreled through the melee, its armored hide shrugging off gunfire. Wukong planted his staff vaulted up, and as he reached the apex of his arc, he plucked a single hair from his head.
Change.
The hair became 10 copies of him. Then 20. They scattered like birds, each one landing on a different section of the Leviathan's body. The beast thrashed, trying to shake them off, but every movement drove it into tighter circles until it collapsed under its own confused weight, crashing into a cluster of outriders and flattening them. Tony Stark, hovering 30 feet up in his armor, watched through his HUD.
Great, another god.
He fired a repulsor at an incoming dropship, barely registering the explosion as he spoke into the comms.
Strange, you want to tell me what that is? Later. Later, he just turned a Leviathan into a pretzel with his hair. I said later.
On the ground, Wanda Maximoff tore through a battalion of outriders with red energy that crackled like lightning. She felt it before she saw it. A ripple in reality, subtle but sharp, like a string being plucked in a dimension she could barely perceive. Her head snapped toward Wukong. Whoever he wasn't just strong. He was bending the rules. And that made him dangerous. Across the field, Thanos remained motionless. His army surged forward, but he stayed rooted, blade resting against the ground, now eyes tracking the small figure who moved through his forces like a scalpel through skin. Precise, efficient, mocking. Ebony Maw stepped forward, his voice a whisper of silk over gravel.
Shall I remove him, my lord?
Thanos didn't answer immediately. He watched Wukong redirect a missile back toward its launcher, watched him yank a war machine's leg out from under it with a flick of his staff. The Titan's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on the hilt of his blade.
Not you, all of them.
The Black Order moved as one. Ebony Maw Cull Obsidian Proxima Midnight. They cut through the battlefield toward Wukong, a coordinated strike force designed to eliminate high-value threats. Wukong saw them coming. He stopped walking, planted his staff, and smiled.
Finally, someone who knows how to send a proper invitation.
Ebony Maw struck first telekinetic force rippling outward like an invisible tsunami. Debris lifted into the air, jagged chunks of concrete and metal, spinning into a lethal storm aimed at Wukong's position. Wukong spun his staff once. The debris froze mid-flight, trembled, then reversed direction, hurtling back toward Maw twice as fast. The sorcerer barely managed to deflect it, his eyes widening in something that might have been surprise. Cull Obsidian charged next, his warhammer raised high enough to crack a tank. Wukong didn't dodge. He stepped forward inside the swing and tapped the hammer's shaft with 2 fingers. The weapon folded in on itself like paper. Cull stared at the ruined metal in his hands. Wukong kicked him in the chest, a lazy push that sent the massive warrior tumbling backward into a group of his own soldiers. Proxima Midnight came from the side, her spear a blur of lethal intent. Wukong caught it between 2 fingers, held it there while she strained to pull it free, then flicked it aside. The weapon spun through the air and embedded itself in a Chitauri chariot 20 yards away.
You fight like you're trying to win. That's your first mistake.
He wasn't killing them. He was humiliating them, making them fight their own momentum, their own strength, their own tactics. And across the field, Thanos watched, and Steve Rogers watched Thanos, and Doctor Strange watched them all, because Strange knew what no one else did yet. This wasn't about Wukong winning. It was about Wukong existing, about being a piece on the board that didn't follow the rules of the game. And if he stayed on this board, if he kept fighting here, everything would break. Not just the battle, the world. Strange's hands began to glow. Not the orange sparks of the portals, something deeper, colder. The geometry of the mirror dimension, ready to split reality into layers. But first, he had to make Wukong choose to go. And you didn't make someone like Sun Wukong do anything. You gave him a reason. A challenge. A door. Strange stepped through the chaos toward the man who was currently juggling 3 Black Order members like they were training dummies.
We need to talk.
Wukong caught Proxima's spear mid-throw, planted it in the ground, and leaned on it like a walking stick.
You're about to break this planet, not on purpose, just because you can.
Wukong's smile didn't fade, but his eyes sharpened.
And that bothers you. It bothers the people standing on it.
For a moment, the two of them stood in a pocket of stillness while the war raged around them. Wukong studied Strange the way a craftsman might study another's work. Evaluating, measuring.
Well, you're not bad. For a mortal sorcerer, I'm not giving orders, I'm offering a solution. To whose problem? Both of ours.
Wukong's grin widened. He pulled the spear from the ground and tossed it back to Proxima, who caught it and immediately retreated, regrouping with Maw and Kull.
Show me this solution, and if your door breaks, I'm coming back through and tearing this one off its hinges.
Strange's hands moved. The air split. Not a portal, a wound, a fold in space that opened into something vast and empty and cold. The mirror dimension reshaped into a pocket battlefield, where the rules of Earth's reality no longer applied. Wukong looked into it, then back at Strange.
Big enough, for you will find out.
And Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, the great sage equal to heaven, stepped through the door with the eagerness of a child finding a new playground. Behind him, Thanos' eyes followed. And then the Titan moved, blade in hand, stepping toward the rift, with his most loyal soldiers at his back. Because if there was one thing Thanos understood, it was this: you didn't leave variables alive. The door closed behind them, with a sound like shattering glass. On Earth, the battle continued. But now, it was just war. The other war, the one that would decide if reality itself could hold together, had just begun somewhere else entirely. The mirror dimension felt wrong the moment Wukong stepped through. Not hostile, just different. Like walking into a room where gravity pointed sideways and color operated on rules nobody had explained yet. Fractured architecture stretched in impossible directions. Crystalline surfaces reflected versions of themselves that didn't quite match. The sky, if it could be called that, shifted between amber and void, pulsing with a rhythm that had nothing to do with heartbeats or time. Wukong planted his staff and spun in a slow circle, taking inventory.
Interesting trick. Does it come with furniture?
Strange materialized 10 paces away, cloak rippling despite the absence of wind. Behind him, the tear in reality sealed itself with a sound like ice cracking in reverse.
It comes with space. Use it however you want. Just keep the damage here.
Wukong's expression didn't shift, but something in his posture relaxed. Like a musician finally given an instrument worth playing.
And if I don't, then Earth loses before Thanos even gets his chance.
For 3 seconds, neither moved. Then Wukong laughed short and sharp.
You mortals, always threatening yourselves to get what you want.
The rift tore open again, violent this time, and Thanos stepped through with the Black Order flanking him like shadows made solid. Behind them came the Chitauri elite, the ones with actual armor instead of organic plating, and a cluster of war machines that hummed with contained energy. The Titan surveyed the fractured landscape without expression. His blade rested against his shoulder, relaxed, but his eyes tracked every angle, every surface, cataloging exits and weaknesses with the efficiency of a general who had conquered 1,000 worlds.
This changes nothing.
Strange stepped back, hands already weaving defensive sigils, but he didn't attack, didn't interfere. He'd made his bargain. Now he had to watch it play out. Wukong tilted his head, studying Thanos, the way a craftsman might examine a particularly stubborn knot in wood.
You really believe that the balance speech, the culling, the whole tragic destiny act?
Thanos didn't answer. He gestured once, palm flat, and the Black Order surged forward. Ebony Maw led telekinetic force rippling outward in concentric waves that shattered the crystalline floor into shrapnel. The debris accelerated mid-flight, each piece honed into a projectile sharp enough to pierce steel. Wukong didn't dodge. He tapped his staff once against the ground. The shrapnel stopped, hung suspended in the air for a heartbeat. then scattered in every direction except toward him, forcing Ma to shield himself with his own power while Proxima Midnight dove left and Cull Obsidian raised his intact arm to block.
Wrong angle.
Cull charged, roaring the sound echoing strangely in the warped space. His fist came down like a meteor, fast enough to crack stone. Wukong sidestepped minimal movement, and the blow struck empty ground. The impact sent cracks spiderwebbing through the floor. But before Cull could recover, Wukong was behind him, staff pressed lightly against the back of his knee. The massive warrior buckled. Not from force, from geometry. His own momentum bent wrong, folded him down, and suddenly he was kneeling off balance, vulnerable. Wukong stepped away before Proxima's spear could reach him, already moving toward the advancing Chitauri line. They fired in unison, energy bolts converging on his position with military precision. He plucked a hair.
Change.
10 copies burst into existence, each one moving independently. The Chitauri hesitated, targeting systems confused, and in that half-second of delay, the real Wukong closed the distance. He didn't strike with the staff. Instead, he touched the lead soldier's weapon, 2 fingers against the barrel, and the gun twisted in its wielder's grip, firing point blank into the one beside it. Then the next. Then the next. A chain reaction of friendly fire that collapsed the formation from within. The clones vanished, task complete. Back on Earth, the battle raged with the intensity of storms grinding against coastlines. Carol Danvers tore through a Leviathan's armor light, trailing behind her like a comet's tail. Wanda held a section of the line alone, red energy forming barriers that caught incoming fire and hurled it back, doubled. Tony coordinated from above, HUD painting trajectories and target priorities across his vision.
Rhodey, you're 6. Thor, we need lightning on the east cluster. Cap, the gauntlets moving. We need...
Sanctuary 2 fired again. The barrage screamed down like the fist of an angry god, and the ground erupted in fire and shrapnel. Tony barely managed to redirect a cluster of missiles with a repulsor burst, but 3 got through, impacting near the ruined compound's foundation.
We can't keep this up. That ship needs to go down. Working on it.
Carol shot upward fists, trailing photon energy. But the cruiser's point defense came alive, filling the sky with tracer fire that forced even her to weave and dodge. Inside the mirror dimension, Thanos watched Wukong dismantle his forces with the detached interest of a scientist observing an unexpected result. The Monkey King moved like water through cracks, never where the attacks landed, always where the openings formed. Ebony Maw tried a different approach, lifting an entire section of the fractured floor and slamming it down from above. Wukong caught it on his staff, held it there for 2 seconds, while Maw strained, then rotated the staff 90 degrees. The massive slab spun, carried by its own weight, and crashed into a group of war machines that were trying to flank from the left. Metal screamed. Systems sparked and died.
You're trying too hard. Relax. Let it happen.
Proxima Midnight came from 3 angles simultaneously, her spear splitting into holographic copies that attacked as if solid. 2 were illusions. 1 was real. But Wukong didn't bother checking which was which. He spun his staff in a circle, not touching any of the spears, just creating a current in the air that pulled them off course. The real spear skipped past his shoulder so close it should have drawn blood and embedded itself in the wall behind him. Proxima pulled, trying to recall the weapon. It didn't budge. Wukong had touched it during the spin 2 fingers, and now it was stuck fused to the crystalline surface as if welded there.
Better luck next time.
Strange stood at the edge of the battlefield, hands glowing, but still watching the patterns emerge. Wukong wasn't fighting. He was teaching. Showing them that their strength, their coordination, their weapons, all of it was just variables in an equation he could solve without effort. And the equation was starting to warp the space around it. Hairline cracks appeared in the mirror dimension structure. Not from Wukong's attacks, from his presence, from the way he bent momentum and redirected force. The dimension was designed to contain magic, not to hold something that treated physics like a suggestion.
Wong, you seeing this?
Wong stood beside him, circles of defensive magic spinning around his forearms.
He's not even trying yet. I know.
On Earth, Steve rallied a cluster of Wakandan warriors and what remained of the Asgardian forces. They held the center line shield's interlocking, repelling wave after wave of outriders that threw themselves forward with mindless hunger.
Hold the line.
But the pressure never stopped. For every enemy that fell, two more took its place. And above Sanctuary, two remained untouched, its cannon cycling for another volley. Peter swung through the chaos gauntlet pressed against his chest, dodging energy blasts and grabbing civilians who hadn't made it to the evac zones.
Mr. Stark, I really think someone should do something about that spaceship. Peter, focus on the gauntlet. Carol's on it. She's been on it for like 10 minutes. Kid, focus.
In the mirror dimension, Thanos finally moved. He didn't charge, didn't roar or telegraph. He simply walked forward, blade cutting through one of Wukong's clones, as if it were mist, heading directly toward the original, with the certainty of a man who had calculated the only path that mattered. Wukong stopped playing. His staff came up, blocking the blade's downward arc, with a sound like a gong struck in a cathedral. The impact sent shockwaves through the fractured floor, and for the first time since entering this space, Wukong's expression sharpened.
There you are.
Thanos pressed down, applying force that should have driven Wukong into the ground. The staff held. Didn't bend, didn't crack, just held, absorbing pressure that could crumple starship hulls.
Strength is one answer, not the only answer.
Wukong twisted, redirecting the blade's edge past his shoulder, and stepped inside Thanos' guard. His free hand shot forward, palm open, aimed at the Titan's center mass. Thanos caught the strike on his forearm, and the collision produced a sound like thunder compressed into a single syllable. Both fighters slid backward, boots carving trenches in the crystal. For 3 seconds they stood 10 feet apart, measuring each other. Then Thanos raised his left hand. The Infinity Gauntlet gleamed, all 6 stones seated and pulsing with contained power. He didn't activate them. Didn't need to. The threat was enough.
You are skilled, but skill ends where inevitability begins. Inevitability is just another word for giving up.
Thanos' jaw tightened, the only sign that the words had landed. His thumb moved toward the Power Stone. Wukong grinned.
Go ahead. Use them. Show me what borrowed power looks like when it meets something that was never meant to kneel.
Strange's hands snapped up, forming a barrier between the two combatants, before either could escalate further.
Not yet, not like this.
Both Wukong and Thanos turned toward him, and for a moment, Strange felt the weight of their attention like gravity from 2 collapsing stars.
You want to break everything, fine. But not while half of my allies are standing 3 feet from ground zero.
Wukong lowered his staff just slightly.
Your door, your rules.
Thanos said nothing. But his hand moved away from the gauntlet, and the pressure in the air dropped by a fraction. Strange exhaled. The barrier dissolved.
We need a different arrangement, bigger space, fewer witnesses, or this dimension collapses and takes a chunk of reality with it.
Wukong laughed.
Finally, someone who understands architecture.
On Earth, the tide shifted. Carol finally breached Sanctuary 2's defenses, punching through the hull and into the ship's core. Explosions bloomed along its spine, and the great vessel began to list its weapons, cycling down as systems failed. Tony saw it through his HUD.
That's our window, everyone push now.
The Avengers surged forward, seizing the momentum, driving the enemy back toward the ruined compound. For the first time since the battle began, they weren't just surviving. They were advancing. But inside the mirror dimension, Strange looked at the cracks spreading through the walls, at Wukong's casual stance, at Thanos' calculating silence, and knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't close to over. This was barely the opening move, and when the real game started, the board might not survive it. Thanos stood at the edge of the fractured battlefield, gauntlet hand loose at his side. Watching Wukong dismantle the Chitauri formation with the efficiency of someone pruning a garden, the Titan's face remained carved from stone, but his mind moved with the precision of a blade finding the seam in armor. Variables. In war and conquest, in the pursuit of balance, variables were inevitable. Most could be absorbed, redirected, folded into the plan. But some variables existed outside the framework, entirely introducing chaos that couldn't be calculated or contained. Sun Wukong was that kind of variable. Ebony Maw drifted closer, his thin frame hovering a foot above the cracked crystal floor. His voice carried the texture of silk dragged over broken glass.
My lord, shall I? No.
Thanos turned his head fractionally, just enough to bring the Black Order into his peripheral vision. Proxima Midnight stood ready, spear reformed from nanites after the last engagement. Cull Obsidian flexed his remaining hand knuckles, popping like small detonations. Behind them, what remained of the elite guard waited with the patience of machines built for violence.
All of you, together, end this distraction.
Ebony Maw's eyes widened just slightly. For Thanos to commit the entire order to a single target meant one thing: the target had graduated from annoyance to genuine threat. Maw inclined his head.
As you command.
The three moved as one unit, their steps synchronized despite the warped geometry. No hesitation, no grandstanding. Just lethal intent compressed into tactical formation. Wukong saw them coming. He'd been balancing on his staff, one foot planted on the top end, while it stood vertical, watching a cluster of war machines try to reorganize after he'd convinced their targeting systems that they were each other's primary threats. He hopped down, staff spinning back into his grip.
Round 2 already, you're eager.
Ebony Maw struck first, but not directly. The space between them compressed, folding like paper being crumpled, trying to crush Wukong in a pocket of condensed reality. Simultaneously, the floor beneath erupted upward in spikes of crystalline material controlled and shaped by Maw's telekinesis. Wukong tapped the ground with his staff. The compression stopped. Just stopped, as if it had hit a wall made of negation. The spikes, reversed direction mid-formation, drove themselves back down, and the space unfolded with a sound like fabric tearing.
Tighter focus, looser grip.
Proxima came from behind, but Wukong didn't turn. He shifted his weight, leaned left, and her spear passed through empty air where his spine had been a fraction of a second earlier. She recovered instantly, weapon morphing into a whip that lashed out 3 times in rapid succession. Wukong caught the first strike between 2 fingers, dodged the second by bending at an angle that shouldn't have been possible without breaking vertebrae. The third wrapped around his ankle. Proxima pulled, trying to yank him off balance. Wukong let himself be pulled, flew toward her like a missile staff extended. She barely got her weapon up in time to parry, and the impact sent her sliding backward, boots carving trenches in the crystal.
Better timing, wrong commitment.
Cull Obsidian didn't try for finesse. He simply charged mass and momentum, compressed into a battering ram of muscle and armor. The ground shook with each step. Wukong planted his staff horizontally at waist height and waited. Cull hit the staff like a freight train hitting a steel cable. His upper body stopped. His legs kept going. The result was physics applied with brutal efficiency. Cull flipped over the staff, crashed upside down, and slid 30 feet before coming to rest in a crater of his own making. Ebony Maw didn't pause to process the failure. He layered the assault, lifting debris machinery, even sections of the mirror dimension's walls, and hurled them in overlapping waves. Not to hit Wukong directly, to limit his options, to pen him in. The debris formed a closing sphere converging from all angles. Wukong plucked 3 hairs.
Change.
The copies appeared at the sphere's edge, each one striking a different point simultaneously. The debris shattered outward, and in the chaos, the real Wukong stepped through a gap that hadn't existed a second before, already behind Maw's position. Maw spun, throwing up a telekinetic shield, but Wukong didn't attack. He just stood there, staff resting on his shoulder, waiting.
You're thinking too hard, trying to control everything. That's not how flow works.
Proxima attacked from the flank, coordinating with Cull, who had recovered and was thundering in from the opposite side. A pincer movement textbook execution designed to eliminate escape vectors. Wukong dropped into a crouch. Both attacks passed over his head. Proxima's spear and Kull's fist meeting each other with the force of colliding meteors. The shockwave knocked them both backward, stunned, and Wukong rose between them, utterly unruffled.
So you did the work for me.
On Earth, the battle had shifted into a grinding stalemate. Sanctuary 2 hung crippled in the sky. Its main guns silent, but secondary batteries still spat fire at irregular intervals. Carol had done her job, but the ship refused to die completely. Tony coordinated triage from 3 fronts at once. HUD tracking wounded ammunition counts, structural integrity of the remaining fortifications.
We're holding, but barely. Somebody tell me Strange is about to pull a miracle, 'cause we're running on fumes here.
Steve blocked a strike from an outrider's shield ringing like a bell and drove the creature back with a kick.
Strange is handling something else. We hold until he's done. Define handling. I don't know, but I trust him.
Peter swung past Gauntlet, still secure dodging energy fire that left scorch marks on the rubble around him.
This would be a really great time for some backup, just saying.
Inside the mirror dimension, Strange watched the Black Order's coordinated assault fall apart piece by piece. Not because they were weak, not because their tactics were flawed, but because Wukong existed in a space where tactics became irrelevant, where strength measured nothing, where control was an illusion. Wong stood beside him, defensive sigils spinning around his forearms in concentric rings.
He's not even trying. I know. If he decides to try, I know.
The cracks in the mirror dimension had spread. Thin lines of void traced across surfaces that shouldn't be able to crack bleeding darkness into a space designed to be malleable but stable. The structure was failing not from damage, but from incompatibility. Like trying to run software on hardware that didn't speak the same language. Ebony Maw made one final attempt, gathering every piece of debris, every fragment of machinery, everything loose or movable, and compressing it into a single point. A sphere of concentrated mass that warped light around its edges. He hurled it with all the force his mind could generate. Wukong extended one finger. The sphere stopped, hung in the air, trembling, then collapsed inward, folding down to the size of a marble, which dropped to the ground and rolled away with a tiny clink.
Compression only works if the structure agrees to compress.
Proxima Midnight and Gonkul Obsidian exchanged a glance. In that glance was the wordless communication of soldiers who had fought together through 100 campaigns and knew when to escalate. They attacked together, truly together. Not coordinated strikes, but a unified assault where each movement flowed into the next, where Proxima's feints created openings for Kull's power, where Kull's presence forced positioning that made Proxima's precision lethal. Wukong blocked, parried, sidestepped. But for the first time, he wasn't lecturing, wasn't smiling. His expression had shifted into something closer to focus. The staff blurred through defensive patterns ringing against Proxima's spear, deflecting Kull's strikes, never quite where the attacks expected it to be. He was reading them, learning their rhythm, and then he broke it. Mid-exchange, he shifted his stance by half an inch. Proxima's next strike, perfectly timed for where he should have been, passed through empty space. She overextended just barely. Wukong tapped her elbow. The arm went numb. The spear clattered from her grip. Kull, seeing the opening, drove forward with everything he had. Wukong wasn't there. He was to the left, and his staff connected with Kull's knee, not hard, just precisely. The joint buckled. Kull fell. Wukong stepped back, allowing them space to recover.
You fight well, you fight smart, but you fight inside a box. And I'm not in the box with you.
Thanos watched this from his position at the battlefield's edge. His expression hadn't changed. His posture hadn't shifted. But something in his eyes had crystallized into certainty. This entity couldn't be contained through force, couldn't be outmaneuvered through tactics, couldn't be worn down through attrition, which meant the variable had to be removed from the equation entirely. And there was only one tool in Thanos' arsenal capable of absolute removal. His left hand rose. The Infinity Gauntlet gleamed all 6 stones, pulsing with light that hurt to look at directly. He hadn't wanted to use them here. Using them meant acknowledging the threat as existential. But pragmatism always trumped pride. Before his thumb could touch the Power Stone, Strange moved. The sorcerer appeared between Thanos and Wukong in a flash of golden light and spread defensive wards spinning into existence with geometric precision.
Stop.
Thanos' eyes narrowed.
You think those shields will hold? No, but they'll buy time for what I'm about to say.
Wukong tilted his head, curious. The Black Order, battered and frustrated, held position but didn't retreat.
Use the stones here in the space against him, and the mirror dimension doesn't just crack. It detonates, and when it detonates, it takes a chunk of Earth's reality with it. Brooklyn. Maybe Manhattan. Possibly the eastern seaboard.
Thanos' thumb paused. Not from mercy, from calculation. Destroying half the universe was acceptable. Destroying it prematurely through collateral damage was not.
Then you propose, I expand this space. Make it bigger, stable enough to handle what you're both capable of. And you settle this there, where the only thing that breaks is what you choose to break.
Wukong laughed, sharp and genuine.
The mortal sorcerer wants to build us a bigger playground. How considerate. I'm not being considerate, I'm being practical.
Strange turned to Wukong, and his voice dropped into something colder.
You want to fight, but not on my planet. Not where people I care about breathe the same air you're about to turn into shrapnel.
For 5 seconds, nobody moved. Thanos calculating odds. Wukong measuring Strange's resolve. The Black Order waiting for orders that didn't come. Then Wukong spun his staff, planted it.
Fine. Expand your door, but make it big enough for what comes next, because I'm done playing gentle.
Thanos lowered his hand. The stone's light dimmed.
Agreed.
Strange exhaled, hands already moving into position. Wong joined him, their magic interweaving, preparing to do something that hadn't been attempted since the Ancient One's time, weaponizing the mirror dimension itself. On Earth, Tony's HUD lit up with a proximity alert, not from the enemy, from something else. Something that made his threat assessment algorithm spike into the red.
Strange, whatever you're doing, do it fast. Because sensors just detected a spatial anomaly expanding from your position, and if it reaches critical mass before you stabilize it... I know, Wong and I are handling it. Handling it how? Creatively.
The connection cut. Tony swore under his breath, firing repulsors at an incoming cluster of outriders, while running calculations he desperately hoped were wrong. They weren't. Inside the mirror dimension, Strange and Wong stood back-to-back hands, weaving patterns that made the air itself seem to fold and breathe. The cracks stopped spreading, for now, but the pressure was building. And when the door opened to the bigger space, when Wukong stopped holding back, when Thanos decided half measures weren't sufficient, the war would become something else entirely, something nobody was prepared for. Strange's hands trembled, not from fear, from the weight of what he was about to attempt. The mirror dimension had never been designed as a containment field for gods. It was a tool, a scalpel. What he needed now was a blast furnace with walls thick enough to survive what got thrown inside. Wong finished the last sigil, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold void light of the fractured space around them.
This is insane. Probably. If we miscalculate the expansion ratio, then we die. Along with everyone within a 50-mile radius, I'm aware.
Wukong watched them work with the lazy attention of a cat, observing mice attempting architecture. He'd planted his staff and sat cross-legged on top of it, hovering 3 feet off the ground, chin resting on one hand.
Your magic smells nervous.
Strange didn't look up from his work, golden threads of energy weaving between his fingers like surgical sutures.
My magic is pragmatic. There's a difference. Pragmatic would be letting me finish what I started. Quick, clean, over. Pragmatic is keeping the planet intact.
Wukong tilted his head, genuinely curious now.
You think I'd break it? I think you'd forget it was there.
The response caught Wukong off guard. Not insulted, not angry, just surprised that someone understood the distinction. He dropped from his perch, landing without sound, and walked closer.
Show me this door of yours. If it's too small, I'm coming back through and we revisit your definition of pragmatic.
Strange straightened, meeting Wukong's gaze. The Monkey King's eyes held that unsettling quality of ancient things that had watched civilizations bloom and rot. But Strange had negotiated with Dormammu, with entities that ate dimensions for sustenance. Age didn't intimidate him. Intent did.
It'll be big enough. Question is whether you're disciplined enough to stay inside it.
Wukong's grin sharpened.
Disciplined. That's a word nobody's used for me in about 4 centuries. Then prove it, or prove you're just another tantrum with good press.
For 2 heartbeats, the space between them compressed with potential violence. Then Wukong laughed, genuine and delighted.
Not terrible. For a mortal who's only been playing with magic for what, a decade? 8 years. And I had good teachers. Dead teachers from what I hear.
Strange's jaw tightened. Wukong noticed, and his expression shifted fractionally. Not apologetic, but acknowledging he'd stepped somewhere sharp.
Sorry, Death and I have a complicated relationship. Sometimes I forget others take it personally.
Before Strange could respond, Thanos' voice cut across the battlefield like a blade through silk.
Enough philosophy. Open your door, sorcerer, or I end this discussion with tools you won't survive.
The Titan had moved closer during their exchange gauntlet, raised thumb hovering over the Reality Stone. Behind him, the Black Order had reformed into a wedge formation. Weapons-ready eyes tracking Wukong with the focus of predators who'd learned their prey had teeth. Strange turned, cloak billowing despite the absence of wind.
You use those stones in this space in its current configuration, and the backlash won't just kill us. It'll tear a hole in space-time big enough to swallow the eastern seaboard, maybe more.
Thanos didn't lower his hand.
Then work faster.
Wong stepped forward, hands glowing.
My lord, if I may. You may not.
The contempt in Thanos' voice wasn't personal. It was structural. Wong was an obstacle. Obstacles got removed. But Strange placed a hand on Wong's shoulder, pulling him back.
He's right. We're out of time.
Strange closed his eyes, drew breath, and began. The spell wasn't a single incantation. It was architecture built from will and mathematics. Each gesture a load-bearing wall, each word a foundation stone. The mirror dimension responded, its malleable nature bending to his intent, and cracks that had been spreading suddenly reversed, sealed by bands of golden light that wrapped around them like surgical thread. But sealing wasn't enough. He needed expansion, volume, a pocket reality large enough to contain what happened when irresistible force met a movable object without innocent bystanders turning into collateral geometry. Wong joined his magic to Strange's, their energies interweaving. The dimensions shuddered, stretched, groaned with the sound of tectonic plates grinding against mathematics that shouldn't exist. Wukong watched with professional interest.
Ambitious. Let's see if your structure holds.
He lifted his staff, didn't swing it, didn't strike, just tapped it once against the ground. Reality hiccuped. The force rippled outward, testing the boundaries of Strange's construction, probing for weaknesses the way a river finds cracks in a dam. The mirror dimension buckled, warped. Several of the newly sealed cracks reopened, and through them, bleeding like wounds, came glimpses of Earth's actual sky. Strange gritted his teeth, sweat now running freely down his face. Wong's hands trembled as he reinforced the weak points, but new ones appeared faster than they could patch.
Not bad, but not enough.
Wukong lifted the staff for a second tap. Strange's hand snapped up, fingers splayed, and the space between Wukong's staff and the ground suddenly contained 7 overlapping layers of shielding, each one a different school of defensive magic stacked like armor plates. The staff touched the shield, stopped for 1 second, then punched through 6 of the 7 layers before Strange managed to reinforce the last one enough to hold. Wukong's eyebrows rose.
Huh. You're faster than you look.
Strange was panting now, blood trickling from his nose, where the strain had burst capillaries. But his voice stayed level.
Fast enough to know when to stop playing defense. Wong, now.
Wong released the anchors he'd been holding, and the mirror dimension exploded outward. Not violently, but inexorably. Like a balloon, inflating and fast forward. The fractured architecture rushed away in all directions, walls and floors, multiplying dimensions, stacking on dimensions, creating a space that was simultaneously vast and claustrophobic. Where distance became negotiable and gravity was a polite suggestion rather than a law. Wukong's grin widened.
Now we're talking.
Strange opened his eyes bloodshot and burning with focus.
Boundaries set. No bleed through to Earth. No collateral beyond what you choose to break in here. Fight however you want.
He turned to Thanos.
That includes you. Stone's blade, whatever. But you step foot outside this pocket and I collapse it on both of you.
Thanos studied Strange with the cold attention of a general assessing a subordinate who'd just done something unexpectedly competent.
You threaten me. I inform you, there's a difference.
For 3 seconds, the Titan weighed options. Then his lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile.
Acceptable.
He stepped forward into the expanded space, Black Order flowing behind him, like shadows cast by a fire that burned with single-minded purpose. They moved deeper into the pocket dimension, weapons drawn already scanning for tactical advantages in the warped terrain. Wukong hopped onto his staff again, balancing effortlessly.
Mortal sorcerer. You just gave me the keys to a playground with no rules. You sure that's wise? Wisdom doesn't enter into it. Necessity does. Fair.
Wukong's expression shifted, still amused. But underneath something sharper, more dangerous.
When this is over, if you survive, remind me to buy you a drink. You've earned it. I don't drink with people who might kill me. Everyone might kill you. That's what makes life interesting.
Before Strange could respond, Wukong vaulted forward into the depths of the expanded dimension, already accelerating staff beginning to glow with energy that made the air taste like brass and ozone. Strange watched him go, then turned back toward the boundary where Earth's reality still existed, separated now by walls of magic that felt thinner than they should. Wong appeared beside him, wiping blood from his own nose.
You realize we just locked ourselves out of our own spell. I know. If they break containment, they won't. Because if they do, we collapse it and hope the implosion kills them before the shrapnel kills us.
Wong stared.
That's your plan, Hope. You have a better one.
Before Wong could answer, the boundary shimmered, and Strange stepped through it back toward Earth's battlefield. The transition felt like pushing through a membrane made of ice and regret. The Avengers compound spread before him, still burning in places, still crawling with enemy forces. But fewer now. The absence of Thanos and his elite guard had created confusion in the ranks. Leaderless outriders fought on instinct rather than coordination. War machines cycled through default targeting protocols without strategic oversight. Carol descended from the sky, landing beside Strange with enough force to crack the concrete.
Where is he?
Thanos.
Both of them. The Titan and the new guy.
Somewhere else. Fighting a war we can't help with.
Thor appeared, Stormbreaker resting on his shoulder, lightning still crackling around his frame.
Explain somewhere else. I moved the battlefield. Gave them space to settle things without turning New York into a crater.
Tony dropped from the sky armor, scorched and dented, but functional.
So we're fighting the leftovers while the real battle happens in another dimension. That's the play. That's the reality. I hate magic.
Wanda Maximoff walked up, red energy still flickering around her hands. She looked at the point where the dimensional barrier existed, invisible to normal sight, but clear to anyone who manipulated reality.
It's thin. Whatever's happening in there is putting pressure on the walls.
I know, which means we need to finish our fight fast, because if containment fails...
He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Steve approached S.H.I.E.L.D. strapped to his forearm uniform, torn and bloody, but eyes clear.
Then we finish it. Wong, can you coordinate with the other sorcerers? We need portals, shields, anything that keeps civilians clear of the blast radius if this goes wrong.
Wong nodded, already forming hand seals.
On it.
Peter swung down from a chunk of rubble, still clutching the gauntlet.
Hey, a quick question. If the dimension explodes, do we explode with it, or is it more of a gets pulled into a void situation? Yes. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Now get that gauntlet to the van. We're out of time for contingencies.
Inside the pocket dimension, the true battle was beginning. Wukong stood in the center of a space that had no center staff planted, head tilted back as if tasting the air. Around him, the architecture shifted and reformed, mountains of crystal growing, and collapsing rivers of void light flowing upward, gravity suggesting rather than demanding. Thanos emerged from the warped terrain like a force of nature given form. The Infinity Gauntlet blazed with all 6 colors, and his blade caught reflections from lights that didn't exist.
No more interruptions, no more delays.
Wukong grinned.
Finally.
The Black Order fanned out, taking positions at different gravitational orientations, and the pocket dimension held its breath. Back on Earth, Strange felt the first tremor through the barrier. Small, barely noticeable, but growing. The real war had started, and nobody knew if the walls would hold. The pocket dimension didn't have weather, but if it did, the moment Wukong stopped holding back would have been the moment before lightning splits the sky. He stood in a space where up and down were suggestions rather than laws. Staff held loosely in one hand and smiled the way someone smiles when finally allowed to stretch after sitting too long in a cramped chair.
No civilians, no collateral, no consequences except the ones we make.
Thanos watched from 50 yards away, or maybe 50 miles distance, behaving strangely here. The Titan's blade rested against the warped ground, and his gauntlet hand flexed once, testing the responsiveness of the stones.
You assume that improves your position. I assume nothing. I just prefer honest work.
The Black Order had spread into a defensive perimeter around Thanos' weapons-drawn eyes, tracking Wukong with the wariness of soldiers who'd learned that underestimating this opponent meant waking up embedded in a wall. Ebony Maw floated forward slightly, hands already weaving telekinetic patterns.
My lord, allow us to hold position, observe.
Thanos' eyes never left Wukong. He'd seen power before, conquered it, redirected it. But this entity moved through combat, like water finding cracks in stone, and water given enough time and freedom could carve mountains into dust. Wukong spun his staff once. Not an attack, just a rotation, casual. The horizon bent, not metaphorically. The line where the warped sky met the crystalline ground curved upward at both ends, forming a smile-shaped arc that shouldn't have been possible in three-dimensional space. Gravity hiccuped. Several chunks of floating debris that had been drifting aimlessly suddenly accelerated toward each other, colliding with force that produced light instead of sound.
Interesting architecture your sorcerer built. Let's test the foundations.
He planted the staff and pushed down. The ground cracked. Not shattered. Cracked the way ice cracks when something massive steps onto a frozen lake. The fractures spread in geometric patterns, each line branching into smaller lines, and where they intersected, space folded inward, creating pockets of compressed reality that looked like bruises on the fabric of existence. Thanos raised the gauntlet. The space stone flared blue, stabilizing the ground beneath his feet, creating an island of normal physics in an ocean of chaos.
Reality manipulation, crude but effective.
He activated the power stone, next purple energy cascading down his arm, and drove his fist into the stabilized ground. The shockwave erupted outward in a perfect sphere, raw kinetic force that should have flattened everything within 100 yards. Should have. Instead, it hit Wukong's position and bent around it, redirected by a twist of the staff that made the energy flow like water around a stone in a stream. The redirected force hit the Black Order's defensive perimeter instead. Proxima Midnight threw up her spear in a blocking position, but the impact lifted her off her feet and hurled her backward into a crystalline outcropping. Cull Obsidian dug in his heels and took the hit head-on, and even his massive frame slid 20 feet before he managed to stop. Ebony Maw erected a telekinetic shield just in time, but the effort left him visibly strained.
Your aim needs work.
Thanos' expression didn't change, but his thumb moved toward the reality stone. The world rewrote itself. Suddenly, Wukong wasn't standing on solid ground. He was standing in quicksand made of crystallized time, each movement requiring twice the effort, each second stretching like taffy. The air thickened into syrup. Light slowed to the point where individual photons became visible, streaking past like sluggish fireflies. Wukong looked down at the temporal quicksand, looked back up at Thanos.
Creative. Wrong fundamental assumption, though.
He didn't fight the slowed time. He stepped sideways, not through space, through the concept of duration itself. One moment he was trapped. The next he stood beside Thanos, having bypassed the intervening distance by simply declining to acknowledge it existed. Thanos' spun blade coming up in a guard position, and Wukong's staff met it with a sound like a bell being struck inside a cathedral. The collision produced a pressure wave that flattened everything within a quarter-mile radius. The Black Order went down like bowling pins. Chunks of landscape vaporized. The boundary walls of the pocket dimension flickered stress fractures appearing in Strange's carefully constructed containment. On Earth, every sorcerer currently maintaining defensive positions felt the tremor. Wong's hands shook mid-gesture, nearly dropping the portal he was stabilizing for evacuation. Strange stumbled, one hand going to his chest, as if something had struck him through the dimensional barrier.
It's starting.
Wanda turned towards the invisible boundary, red energy crackling around her fingers as she sensed the disturbance.
The walls are screaming.
Carol looked between them, fists clenched.
Can we reinforce them?
Not from this side. The pressure's coming from within.
Inside the pocket dimension, Thanos and Wukong had separated, each assessing the other with new calculations. The Titan's blade had a hairline crack running down its center. Nothing catastrophic. But the weapon had been forged to withstand planet-killing forces, and this was the first time anything had managed to damage it. Wukong's staff showed no damage at all, but his eyes held something sharper now. Not anger. Interest.
You're tougher than you look. Most things break when I stop being polite. Politeness is a luxury afforded to those with time to waste.
Thanos activated 3 stones simultaneously. Power, space, and reality. Their energies interweaving into a construct that bent fundamental laws. The ground beneath Wukong ceased to exist. The air around him compressed into a solid block. The light bearing down on him carried the weight of a collapsing star, and Wukong laughed. He didn't shatter the construct. He unwove it. His staff became a blur, not striking the compressed matter, but tapping it at specific points, finding the harmonics, the resonant frequencies, where Thanos' will held the impossible structure together. Tap, 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 tap. The construct fell apart like a building with its support beams removed. The ground returned. The air expanded. The stellar weight dispersed into harmless photons.
You think very geometrically. Useful for empires, less useful for dancing.
Thanos didn't respond verbally. He charged, not a rage-fueled rush. A calculated assault blade leading using his size and reach advantage to keep Wukong at optimal striking distance. The Power Stone augmented his speed. The Space Stone let him teleport mid-swing, appearing at angles that should have been impossible to defend against. Wukong met each strike with minimal movement. Block, parry, redirect. His staff work was economical, almost lazy. Each motion shaving millimeters off the necessary distance. When Thanos teleported behind him, Wukong was already turning. When the blade came down from above, the staff was there first, not meeting force with force, but guiding it past.
Stop trying to hit me. Try to predict where I'll be. Much more interesting problem.
The Black Order recovered, now attempted to flank. Proxima's spear came from the left, Kull's charge from the right. Ebony Maw lifting debris from above. Coordinated, professional, lethal if executed properly. Wukong plucked 5 hairs.
Change.
The copies materialized in front of each attack vector. Not to fight, to intercept. Proxima's spear punched through her target, but the clone grabbed the weapon as it died, yanking it off course. Kull's charge met a clone that detonated on impact, the burst of energy enough to stagger the massive warrior. Maw's debris struck 3 clones and lost all momentum, falling harmlessly. By the time the Black Order reset their positioning, Wukong had closed the distance to Thanos. Again, staff sweeping low. Thanos jumped, activating the Space Stone to hover. From the air, he triggered the Power Stone, and a lance of purple energy screamed downward. Wukong caught it on his staff and spun, redirecting the beam horizontally. It carved through the landscape, vaporizing everything in its path, and the pocket dimension shuddered as a chunk of its mass simply ceased to exist. The walls flickered, transparent for a heartbeat, showing glimpses of Earth's sky through the cracks. Strange felt it like a knife between his ribs.
Wong, get everyone back another 100 yards, now. Strange.
Do it!
Inside the pocket, Wukong landed on a floating island of crystal that hadn't existed 30 seconds ago. He looked around at the destruction, at the missing chunks of reality, at the way space itself was beginning to fray at the edges.
Your universe has a weight limit. Interesting design choice.
Thanos descended, landing heavily, and for the first time since entering this space, his expression showed something other than cold calculation. Not fear, but recognition.
You're not trying to win, you're trying to break everything. Wrong, I'm trying to see how much it takes before something breaks.
He spun the staff overhead and the sky split, not metaphorically. The false sky of the pocket dimension tore like fabric, revealing void behind it. Through the tear came pressure, anti-pressure, the absence of anything trying to rush in and fill the space where reality should be. The Black Order scrambled for cover. Proxima grabbed Kull and pulled him behind a crystalline outcropping. Ebony Maw erected a telekinetic dome, but even that began to crack under the strain. Thanos stood his ground, gauntlet raised, using all 6 stones at once to create a bubble of stable reality around himself. The effort showed in the tension of his jaw, the slight tremor in his stance.
This proves nothing. It proves you're still thinking in terms of winning and losing. That's adorable.
Wukong tapped the tear with his staff, and it widened. The void poured through, and where it touched the pocket dimension's substance, that substance simply stopped being. On Earth, every sensitive instrument in a 100-mile radius screamed warnings. Seismographs registered earthquakes that weren't earthquakes. Magnetic fields inverted. Birds flew in circles, lost. Tony's HUD went haywire with sensor data that contradicted itself.
Jarvis, tell me those readings are wrong. I cannot, sir. Spatial temporal stress is approaching critical thresholds. In English, reality is tearing. If the pocket dimension fails, the implosion will create a void pocket, approximately 30 miles in diameter.
Tony went cold.
Strange. If you can hear me through whatever magic phone line you're using, you need to shut this down, now.
Strange stood at the boundary, hands pressed against the invisible barrier, feeling it buckle under his palms.
I can't. They have to stop themselves, or I collapse it and hope we all survive the backlash.
Inside the pocket dimension, Wukong closed the tear with a gesture. The void retreated. The sky reformed. He looked at Thanos, at the Titan's defensive stance, at the 6 Infinity Stones glowing with combined power, and his smile faded into something more serious.
You're strong, disciplined, you've built a philosophy and turned it into an empire. But you're fighting the wrong war. There is no wrong war, only necessary action. That's the problem. You think necessity justifies control, but control is an illusion. You can't balance what refuses to be measured.
Thanos' hand tightened on his blade.
Then I will eliminate what cannot be controlled. You can try.
The Titan raised his gauntlet thumb, hovering over all 6 stones at once, preparing to channel enough power to rewrite local reality at a fundamental level. And then from Earth came a sound, not loud, not violent. Just a sound like a finger snap, amplified through dimensional barriers, carrying weight that had nothing to do with volume. Tony Stark had used the Infinity Stones. On Earth, Thanos' army began to turn to dust. In the pocket dimension, the pressure changed. Inverted. The stones in Thanos' gauntlet flickered their connection to their counterparts across the barrier, creating feedback that made the Titan stagger. Wukong felt it too, not the stones. The change in momentum, the shift from war to conclusion. He looked toward the boundary toward Earth, and his expression shifted into something almost respectful.
Huh. The mortal chose to pay the price himself.
Thanos looked down at his gauntlet, at the stones that were still functional, but suddenly less relevant. His army, his purpose, his carefully constructed plan, all of it unraveling because someone else had made a different choice. The Titan's shoulders sagged, just slightly, just enough.
This changes nothing. It changes everything. You just don't want to admit it.
The pocket dimension began to stabilize. Not because the fight was over, but because the fuel had run out. Without an army to command, without a goal to pursue, Thanos was just a warrior standing in an empty room. Wukong planted his staff and sat cross-legged on top of it again, floating.
You can keep trying if you want. I'm curious to see how far 6 stones can push someone before the body fails.
Thanos looked at Wukong, at the damage-free staff, at the relaxed posture that suggested he could fight for another century without breathing hard. The Titan lowered his blade.
You have not won. Neither of you. Maybe that's the point.
On Earth, Tony Stark lay dying, surrounded by people who loved him, having just saved half the universe. In the pocket dimension, 2 forces that should have destroyed each other stood in the ruins of a battlefield that had tested reality itself. And somewhere between those 2 spaces, Doctor Strange held the walls together with willpower and magic, and the desperate hope that when this finally ended, there would be something left worth saving. The sky above the Avengers compound had taken on the color of old bruises. Not from smoke or fire, though there was plenty of both. From something else. Something leaking through dimensional barriers that shouldn't exist, turning twilight into a sickly amber that hurt to look at directly. Steve Rogers felt it in his bones. The wrongness. Like standing too close to a live wire, feeling the electricity without touching the metal. He'd been fighting for hours, maybe days, time losing meaning when every second stretched under adrenaline and exhaustion. His shield had a new dent. Deep. Running along the star's lower point where an outrider had gotten through his guard, and he'd blocked with desperation rather than technique. His uniform hung in tatters, blood mixing with dirt, most of it not his own.
Left flank, tighten up.
The Wakandan warriors responded instantly, shields interlocking, forming a barrier that caught the next wave of attackers. But there were always more. The army kept coming directionless now, without Thanos' strategic mind, but no less dangerous. Maybe more so. Panic made them aggressive, unpredictable. Sanctuary, too, hung in the sky like a dying whale, listing to one side trailing smoke from the wounds Carol had carved into its hull. But dying didn't mean dead. Its secondary batteries still functioned, spitting fire at irregular intervals. A barrage screamed down, and Steve barely got his shield up in time, the impact driving him to one knee.
We need that ship down now.
Tony's voice crackled through the comms, strained each word costing effort.
Working on it. Carol's making another run, but those point defense systems are adapting to her attack patterns. She needs covering fire, and we're fresh out of covering anything.
Rhodey's war machine dropped from the sky armor, scorched and sparking.
I'm out of micro-missiles, down to repulsors and harsh language. Then use both. Keep them off her back.
High above, Carol streaked toward the crippled warship Photon Energy, trailing behind her like a comet's tail. Point defense turrets tracked her approach, calculating and opened fire. She weaved through the initial barrage, but one blast clipped her shoulders, spinning her trajectory off course. She recovered, adjusted, drove forward anyway. On the ground, Wanda Maximoff carved through a cluster of Chitauri with red energy that crackled like contained lightning. Her eyes glowed scarlet and her breathing came fast, each breath pulling more power from reserves that felt bottomless and terrifying in equal measure. She felt the dimensional boundary like a wall made of screaming. It hurt to be near it. Hurt worse to ignore it. Something massive was happening on the other side, something that made reality flinch. Strange appeared beside her in a flash of golden sparks, one hand raised.
Don't.
I wasn't.
You're thinking about it. Don't.
Wanda's hands tightened into fists, red energy sparking between her fingers.
People are dying. If whatever's in there could help.
It can't. Different rules, different physics. You cross that threshold and your molecular structure comes apart before you take 3 steps.
You don't know that.
I do. I built it. I know exactly what it costs to exist in there.
Thor landed nearby Stormbreaker, embedded in the ground, using it like an anchor while he caught his breath. His beard was singed. One eye socket had taken a hit that left it swollen, nearly shut.
The Titan. Is he contained? For now. Then let me through. I can end this.
Strange turned and his expression held no sympathy, no apology, just cold mathematical certainty.
No, you die. Then the boundary destabilizes from your death, and everyone within 10 miles dies with you. I am a god. You're a very powerful being with Asgardian physiology. That's not the same thing. And in there against what they're fighting with your tissue paper in a furnace.
Thor's hand tightened on Stormbreaker's handle hard enough to make the weapon hum. For 3 seconds, the god of thunder and the sorcerer supreme locked eyes, and the tension between them could have cut steel. Then Thor yanked his axe free and launched back into the sky without another word, lightning trailing behind him. Wanda watched him go, then looked at Strange.
You're asking us to fight, knowing we can't access our best weapon?
I'm asking you to fight the war that's actually yours. The one in there. That's not a war, that's 2 forces of nature finding out what happens when neither one blinks.
He vanished before she could respond, reappearing 50 yards away to redirect a collapsing building's fall away from a cluster of wounded soldiers. Peter Parker swung through the chaos. The gauntlet still clutched against his chest, and every instinct screamed at him to use it, to put it on, to snap his fingers and make this stop. But Mr. Stark had been very clear about the cost. And Peter had seen enough death today to know that easy solutions usually came with prices nobody wanted to pay.
Somebody tell me where this thing needs to go.
Tony's voice weaker now than it had been an hour ago.
The van, quantum tunnel. We need it back in time, back where it belongs. The van's buried under half the compound. Then dig.
An explosion nearby nearly knocked Peter from his web line. He spun, redirected, kept moving because stopping meant dying, and he'd already seen too many people stop today. At the dimensional boundary, Wong stood with 12 other sorcerers, all of them channeling power into the barrier, reinforcing what Strange had built. Sweat poured down Wong's face, and his hands shook with the effort. One of the younger sorcerers, a woman from the Hong Kong sanctum, stumbled.
Master Wong, I can't the pressure.
Hold, if we break now, the feedback will kill us all.
The woman gritted her teeth, found reserves she didn't know she had, and held. Inside the pocket dimension, though, none of them could see it. Wukong and Thanos stood in the ruins of a battlefield that had tested the limits of constructed reality. The fight had reached a lull not from resolution, but from the change in context. Tony's snap had altered the equation, but on Earth that equation still had variables that needed solving. Carol punched through Sanctuary 2's hull for the 4th time this time, targeting the main reactor. Alarms shrieked. Emergency systems tried to compensate. It wasn't enough. The warship began its final descent. Not falling so much as surrendering to gravity, it had been defying through sheer technological stubbornness. It came down slowly, inexorably, like a mountain deciding to lie down. Steve saw it falling and made a split-second calculation.
Everyone clear the impact zone, move.
The evacuation was chaos choreographed by desperation. Soldiers ran. Sorcerers opened portals. The injured were carried or dragged, and still some wouldn't make it. Wanda threw up a barrier red energy, forming a dome over a cluster of wounded who couldn't run fast enough. The ship hit ground. The impact registered on seismographs 3 states away. A mushroom cloud of debris and fire rose into that sickly amber sky. The shockwave flattened everything within a quarter mile. When the dust began to settle, Wanda still held the barrier. But blood ran from her nose and ears, and her hands trembled so badly, it looked like the energy might slip from her grip at any moment.
Someone, please, I can't see.
Strange appeared beside her, adding his magic to hers, and together they held, until the worst of the debris had passed. Then both collapsed to their knees, gasping. The battlefield had changed. Sanctuary 2's wreckage dominated the landscape, a mountain of twisted metal and dying systems. But the outriders that remained fought on mindless, now running on instinct and programmed aggression. Tony stood in the wreckage of what used to be the compound's east wing, staring at the gauntlet he'd been preparing. The one designed to hold all 6 stones. The one that represented either salvation or suicide, depending on who wore it. His arc reactor flickered. He was running on backup power and stubborn refusal to quit. Beside him, what remained of his armor sparked and hissed more liability than asset now.
Jarvis, odds of survival if I use it. Negligible, sir. Give me a number. 0.03%. And that's optimistic.
Tony looked at the gauntlet. At the stones pulsing with power that could rewrite reality itself. At the price tag attached to using them.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
He picked it up anyway. Steve appeared at the doorway, breathing hard, shield cracked, but still functional.
Tony, don't. You got a better plan. We find one. Together. Cap, we're out of time. Out of options. Out of miracles.
He looked at the gauntlet, then back at Steve.
But we're not out of responsibility.
At the dimensional boundary, the tremors had stopped. Whatever was happening inside had reached some kind of equilibrium, or exhaustion, or mutual understanding. The barrier still held, but barely. Cracks ran through it like spider webs, and through those cracks leaked light that shouldn't exist. Strange stood at the center of those cracks, hands pressed against the failing structure, and made a decision.
Wong, we're sealing it completely. If we do that, we can't open it again. Not quickly. Whatever's in there stays in there until they break through or the structure collapses naturally. I know, do it anyway.
Wong hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then he nodded. The 12 sorcerers formed a circle around the boundary point, their magic interweaving into a pattern that looked like frozen lightning. Strange stood at the center, drawing from reserves he didn't have, burning through his own life force to fuel what came next. The barrier solidified, thickened. The cracks sealed. The light that had been bleeding through cut off like someone had closed a door, and suddenly Earth's battlefield felt smaller, more isolated, more final. No one was coming. No cavalry. No last-minute save from entities fighting wars beyond mortal comprehension. Just soldiers, heroes, people with powers and people with courage and people with nothing left to give except themselves. Steve looked around at what remained. At the wounded, at the exhausted, at the determined.
Avengers, on me. We finished this.
They rallied. Not because they had energy, not because victory was certain, but because someone had to stand, and they decided it would be them. Tony slipped the gauntlet onto his hand. The stones burned even through the armor's interface. Each one felt like swallowing fire. Peter saw him do it.
Mr. Stark, no.
But Tony was already moving, stepping out of the wreckage, into the open, where Thanos' remaining forces could see him. See the stones. See the threat. See the choice he'd already made. Behind the sealed barrier in a pocket dimension that had become a cage for gods and monsters, Wukong felt the snap through dimensional walls. Felt Tony Stark choose to pay the price that no one else could afford. And for the first time since this fight began, the Monkey King went very, very quiet. On Earth, ash began to fall like snow. Not from fire, from people who'd ceased to exist. Thanos' army turning to dust one soldier at a time. Tony Stark stood at the center of it all, gauntlet, smoking arm ruined, but alive. Barely. His heart rate had dropped to dangerous levels. His nervous system was shutting down section by section. But he'd done it. He'd won. And the price had been exactly what Strange said it would be. Everything. Tony Stark had done the math 3 times. Each calculation ended the same way. 0.03% survival. Optimistic. He looked at his hand, at the gauntlet fused to the armor, at the 6 stones pulsing with light that promised either salvation or oblivion, depending on which finger moved first. The arc reactor in his chest flickered. Not from damage. From anticipation. Thanos' remaining forces had lost cohesion. Without their general, without strategic purpose, they fought like animals, backed into corners, dangerous, desperate. Still capable of killing everyone here, if given enough time. Time they didn't have.
Jarvis, if I do this, how long before cascade failure? 12 to 15 seconds, sir. Perhaps less. The gamma radiation alone will. I didn't ask for a medical report, I asked how long. 15 seconds.
Tony nodded once. 15 seconds to save everyone. Seemed fair. Steve appeared at his shoulder shield in one hand, the other hand reaching out like he might physically stop what was about to happen.
Tony, there's always another way. Not this time, Cap. We find one. We always find one.
Tony turned and Steve saw something in his expression that made the words die in his throat. Not resignation. Decision. The kind that couldn't be argued with because it had already been made 3 steps ago.
I've been building to this since that cave in Afghanistan. Everything after that was borrowed time. Turns out the bill came due.
He looked past Steve at the battlefield, at the compound in ruins, at the people still standing, because someone had to stand.
Tell Pepper, tell Morgan, tell them...
He stopped, swallowed, started again.
Tell them 3,000.
Steve's eyes burned, but his voice stayed steady.
I will.
Tony nodded. Stepped past him, into the open space where Thanos' forces could see him clearly. See the gauntlet, see the stones. Inside the pocket dimension, Wukong stood perfectly still, not frozen, just absent of unnecessary movement. His staff rested against his shoulder, and his eyes tracked something in the distance that existed beyond physical space. Thanos stood 20 paces away, blade lowered, gauntlet hand clenched. The Titan had felt it too. The shift. The change in momentum that came from outside their enclosed battlefield.
Your mortal allies are losing. Maybe, maybe not.
Wukong tilted his head, listening to something Thanos couldn't hear.
Someone just made a choice. Interesting choice. Expensive.
Thanos' jaw tightened. He raised his own gauntlet, preparing to trigger the stones to reach across the dimensional barrier and assert control over a situation that was slipping away from him. Wukong's staff came up, not threatening, just present.
You could try that. Burn through the walls, force yourself back, maybe change the outcome, but you won't have time. He's faster than you think. You know this how... 'Cause I'm watching it happen right now.
On Earth, Tony raised his gauntlet hand. The Infinity Stones blazed with combined light that painted shadows in colors that had no names. Every Outrider, every Chitauri, every war machine still functioning turned toward him as if pulled by magnetic force. Thanos, somewhere across the dimensional divide, would feel this, would know what it meant, would understand that his grand design, his perfectly balanced equation, was being erased by one man's refusal to accept inevitability. Tony thought about Pepper, about Morgan, about cheeseburgers and sunsets and normal things that he'd traded for this moment. Worth it, he snapped his fingers. The sound was small, insignificant, like breaking a twig. But the energy released was fundamental. Reality rewrote itself according to new instructions. Thanos' army ceased to exist, each soldier unwoven at the molecular level, turning to ash that drifted on winds that had stopped caring about physics. Inside the pocket dimension, the feedback hit Thanos like a physical blow. His gauntlet flared stones trying to maintain connection with their counterparts across the barrier, and the strain made the Titans stagger. His army, his purpose, his carefully constructed future. All of it dissolving because someone had decided that half the universe was worth dying for.
No, this is...
He raised his hand, preparing to force his will through the dimensional walls to undo what had been done to reassert control. Wukong didn't move to stop him, just watched.
You can try. Stones can do a lot of things. Not sure they can undo a man who's already made peace with the price.
Thanos triggered the stones. All 6. pouring every ounce of will into reaching across the barrier, into grasping for the thread of causality that would let him reverse the snap, rewrite the choice, restore his army. The stones flared, the pocket dimensions shook, cracks appeared in the boundary walls, and nothing changed. Because on Earth, Tony Stark was already dying, and the stones he'd used weren't connected to Thanos' gauntlet anymore. They'd been copied, separated, made independent by technology that shouldn't have worked, but did, because human ingenuity had a way of solving impossible problems when survival demanded it. Thanos felt the truth of it sink in like a blade. He lowered his hand. The stones in his gauntlet dimmed.
Impossible. Improbable, not the same thing.
The Titan stood there, blade-forgotten, gauntlet useless, staring at the dimensional barrier like it had personally betrayed him. His army was gone. His stones were suddenly tools without targets. His entire philosophy, built on the foundation of necessary sacrifice for universal balance, had been answered by one man choosing to sacrifice himself for everyone else. The math didn't work. The logic failed. The scales didn't balance. And Thanos, who had conquered 1,000 worlds through perfect strategic calculation, had no response to someone who simply refused to follow the rules.
This changes nothing. The universe still spirals toward collapse, resources still deplete, the entropy still... Yeah. Heat, death, scarcity, everyone dies eventually. You have a very boring view of inevitability.
Wukong sat cross-legged on his staff, hovering. And for the first time since entering this pocket dimension, his smile had faded into something more serious.
Your problem isn't that you're wrong. It's that you think being right matters more than what people choose to believe. He just chose to believe his life was worth less than theirs. You can't calculate that, can't control it, can't stop it.
Thanos said nothing. But his shoulders, always perfectly squared, sagged fractionally. On Earth, Tony collapsed. The gauntlet fell from his hand, fused to the remains of his armor, smoking. His arc reactor had gone dark. His nervous system was shutting down in waves, each organ system failing in sequence as gamma radiation burned through cells faster than they could repair. Rhodey landed beside him, first armor clanking hands reaching, but not knowing where to touch without causing more damage.
Tony, stay with me. Medical's coming.
Peter dropped from a webline mask, retracting, and his young face went pale.
Mr. Stark, no. You're okay. You're gonna be okay. We won. You can't.
Tony's eyes moved. Found Peter. Found Rhodey. Tried to smile, but his face wouldn't cooperate anymore. Pepper knelt beside him, appearing from somewhere in the chaos, and her hand found his, careful of the burns.
Tony. Hey, look at me.
He did. His eyes focused on her with the last reserves of consciousness he had left.
We're gonna be okay. Morgan's gonna be okay. You can rest now.
His lips moved, formed words that had no sound behind them. But she understood anyway. Had always understood him better than he understood himself. 3,000. The arc reactor's light went out completely. Tony Stark's hand went slack in Pepper's grip. His chest stilled. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The battlefield had gone quiet. Even the sound of falling ash seemed muted, respectful. Then Peter broke a sob tearing out of him that sounded like something being ripped from his chest. Rhodey's head dropped. Pepper closed her eyes, and tears ran down her face without permission. Steve Rogers stood 30 feet away, shield hanging from his hand, and for the first time in 70 years, he felt old. Not physically, but old in the way that came from watching too many good people pay prices they shouldn't have to pay. Inside the pocket dimension, Wukong felt the moment Tony's life ended. Felt it through dimensional walls, like a ripple in water, like a string being cut. He was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. Then he spoke, voice soft enough that Thanos had to strain to hear it.
Mortals. They know they're going to die from the moment they're born. Every single one. And still they choose things worth dying for.
He looked at Thanos.
Your stones can rewrite matter, bend space, reverse entropy, but they can't make someone care less than they do, can't force meaning into actions that reject it. You tried to save the universe by controlling it. He saved it by letting go.
Thanos stared at the dimensional barrier, at the cracks that showed glimpses of Earth's ski, at the evidence of his failure written in the absence of an army he'd spent decades building.
He was weak. He was mortal, not the same thing. Mortality is weakness. Is it?
Wukong stood staff in hand, and for a moment the Monkey King looked less like a trickster and more like something older. Something that had watched civilizations rise and fall, and knew the difference between strength that conquered and strength that endured.
You're immortal, you're powerful, you've bent reality to your will. And right now you're standing in an empty room holding stones that can do anything except the one thing that mattered. He was mortal, he was weak, and he won anyway.
The pocket dimensions shuddered. Not from violence, from absence. The fuel for this fight had burned out. There was no army left to command, no world left to conquer. Just two beings standing in manufactured space, one having lost his purpose and the other having never needed one. Thanos lowered his blade completely. Let it rest against the ground.
What happens now? Now you figure out what you're fighting for when the fight's already over.
Wukong turned away, walking toward the boundary, as if it were a door he could open with permission rather than force. And perhaps it was. Strange's spell had been designed to contain conflict, not imprisonment. With the conflict resolved, the walls were already beginning to thin.
Wait, you're not going to...
Wukong glanced back.
Not my war, not my victory, not my loss. I just came to see if your universe was interesting. Turns out it is. For all the wrong reasons you'd expect and a few right ones you wouldn't.
He touched the barrier. It parted like mist, recognizing that the storm it had been built to contain had passed.
Good luck, Titan. You're gonna need a new dream now. That's harder than conquering worlds.
And Sun Wukong, the great sage, equal to heaven, stepped through the dimensional wall and back onto Earth, where ash still fell like snow. And heroes stood among the ruins of a compound that had never asked to be a battlefield. Behind him, the pocket dimension began its slow collapse. Not violent, just unnecessary now. Strange's magic withdrawing folding space back into itself, leaving no evidence that two forces capable of rewriting reality had met in a place outside of it. Thanos stood alone in the dissolution. His blade, his gauntlet, his stones, all meaningless now. He had wanted balance, order, control. He'd gotten silence. And Tony Stark, who had never claimed to be more than human, had claimed everything else instead. Ash settled like gray snow across the ruins of the Avengers compound. Particulate matter from disintegrated soldiers, pulverized stone, and the burned remains of alien machinery. It coated everything uniformly, erasing distinctions between victor and vanquished hero and battlefield. The silence felt heavier than the explosions had. Steve Rogers sat on a chunk of broken concrete shield resting against his knee. He wasn't injured badly enough to need immediate medical attention, which meant he had time to feel everything the adrenaline had been masking. Exhaustion. Grief. The hollow victory that came from winning at a cost nobody should have paid. Around him, the survivors moved through the wreckage like ghosts. Medical teams triaged the wounded. Sorcerers maintained evacuation portals. Someone had draped a jacket over Tony's body, and Pepper sat beside it, hand resting on fabric that used to be her husband. Nobody spoke. Words felt insufficient, disrespectful even. Wukong stood at the edge of the destruction staff, planted beside him, watching with the detached interest of someone observing weather patterns. He hadn't moved closer, hadn't offered condolences or congratulations, just stood there present but separate like a statue that happened to breathe. Strange approached slowly, each step requiring more effort than the last. His hands still trembled from the spell work, from holding dimensional barriers together, while two forces capable of unmaking reality tested every seam. Wong walked beside him, equally drained, but standing through sheer discipline. They stopped 10 feet from Wukong. Respectful distance. The kind you maintained around things that could erase you without meaning to.
You're still here. For a moment, then not. The others will have questions.
Wukong glanced toward where the Avengers gathered their attention, focused inward on loss and logistics, rather than outward toward unexplained variables.
No, they won't. They have more important things to mourn.
He wasn't wrong. Thor stood beside a crater's stormbreaker, planted in the ground, staring at nothing. Wanda knelt by herself, red energy flickering around her hands, like dying embers. Peter sat with his back against a rubble mask, off crying quietly, while Rhodey stood nearby, not knowing how to help. None of them looked toward the stranger who'd appeared in their war and bent its rules until reality nearly broke. They were too busy processing what it meant to win by losing someone irreplaceable.
You could stay. Answer for what happened in there. Answer to to reality, to the balance you disrupted.
Wukong smiled, but there was no mockery in it. Just tired amusement.
Your universe disrupted itself long before I showed up. I just watched it stress test the walls. They held. Barely. That's all the answer anyone needs.
Strange studied him. Analyzed the threat, the power, the implications of letting something this dangerous simply walk away. Calculated outcomes, assessed risks, then he let him go.
If you come back, I won't. Your universe is interesting, but it's also fragile. Too many cracks in the foundation. Next time someone hits it hard enough, you won't have a pocket dimension to redirect the impact.
Wong stepped forward, hands still glowing faintly with defensive magic that wouldn't stop Wukong, but made him feel better anyway.
Then we strengthened the foundation. Good luck with that. You're building on soil that's already settling.
He pulled his staff from the ground, spun it once, and the air around him began to shimmer. Not a portal, not a tear, just a thinning like reality deciding he'd been a guest long enough and it was time to open the door.
One question, before you go.
Wukong paused, staff balanced on his shoulder.
Why didn't you stop it? Tony's death. You could have. Stepped through, grabbed him before the stones burned through, held a barrier together long enough for someone else to snap. Why let him die?
For 5 seconds, Wukong said nothing. His expression was unreadable. Then he looked toward where Pepper still sat beside her husband's body.
'Cause it wasn't my choice to stop. It was his choice to make. You don't steal someone's sacrifice. That's not respect. That's theft.
Strange's throat tightened. He'd calculated this outcome. 14,605 futures, and this was the only one where they won. But calculation wasn't the same as acceptance.
The stones are tools. Tools don't make choices. People do. Your friend chose. I watched. That's the difference between being strong and being free. He was both.
The shimmer intensified. Wukong's outline began to blur at the edges, as if he were being erased by an editor who decided this character didn't belong in this story anymore.
Your Titan understood a power. Control, balanced through elimination. But he never understood why someone would choose the cost over the outcome. That's why he lost. Not because you were stronger, because you cared more irrationally than he could calculate.
He looked at Strange one last time.
Keep your walls strong, sorcerer. Keep your people alive. And don't open doors for things you're not ready to watch walk through. Is that a threat? It's advice. You mortals are terrible at distinguishing between the two.
And Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, the great sage. Equal to heaven, the entity that had bent a pocket dimension until it screamed and walked away without claiming credit or asking permission. Simply ceased to be there. No flash of light. No dramatic exit. He was present, then absent, like a thought that had completed itself and moved on. The air where he'd stood flexed, once settled and returned to normal. The wrongness that had been pressing against reality's edges withdrew. Strange felt it like pressure releasing from his ears after a descent.
That was over, finally over.
Wong exhaled slowly, defensive posture relaxing by degrees.
Do you think he'll come back? Number. He said he wouldn't, and I believe him. You trust him. I trust that he does what he says. Whether that makes him trustworthy is a different question.
They turned back toward the compound. Toward the work that came after victory. The funerals, the rebuilding, the explaining to a world that had just watched half its population disappear and return in the span of minutes. Carol landed nearby, armor-dented expression carefully neutral.
The dimensional readings are stabilizing. Whatever was in that pocket space is gone.
Thanos.
Still in there as far as I can tell. The dimension's collapsing slowly. He has maybe an hour before it folds completely.
Strange nodded. Thanos trapped in a dissolving pocket of reality with infinity stones that no longer had an army to command or a purpose to serve. A fitting prison. Not cruel, just inevitable.
Let it collapse. He chose his path.
Steve approached S.H.I.E.L.D., now strapped to his back, moving like someone who'd forgotten what it meant to stand without something to fight against.
Strange, the entity, the one who appeared during the portals, gone. Gone where? Elsewhere. Somewhere that isn't here. That's all that matters.
Steve looked at the spot where Wukong had been standing, at the absence that somehow felt more substantial than the presence had.
Did he help us? He prevented something worse. Whether that counts as help is perspective.
Steve nodded slowly, accepting the non-answer, because pressing for details felt less important than dealing with the loss of someone who'd actually mattered to him personally. He walked away, toward where Peter sat, toward the work of helping the living process what survival cost. The sun broke through the ash-choked sky in thin beams that painted everything amber. Fires still burned in isolated pockets. Medical transports arrived and departed. The Wakandans formed honor guards around their fallen. The Asgardians did the same. Pepper stood, finally stepping away from Tony's body, so the medical team could take him somewhere more appropriate than a battlefield. She walked with the stiffness of someone forcing themselves to function, because the alternative was collapsing, and she couldn't afford to collapse yet.
Did we win?
Nobody answered her, but the ash that fell like snow was proof enough. They'd won. They'd survived. Half the universe had been saved, and all it cost was one man's decision to burn himself out like a star so the rest could see by his light. In a pocket dimension that was rapidly ceasing to exist, Thanos sat with his back against a wall that flickered between solid and absent. The Infinity Gauntlet lay beside him, stones dimmed to near darkness. His blade rested across his knees. He'd conquered worlds, balanced populations, built an empire from will and vision. And in the end, one mortal with borrowed technology and too much heart had undone everything he'd spent a lifetime constructing. The walls were closing in, literally. The pocket dimension had maybe 30 minutes left before it collapsed entirely. Thanos could feel it contracting space, folding in on itself. He didn't try to escape. Didn't trigger the stones. Didn't search for a way out. He just sat and waited for the universe to finish what Tony Stark had started. On Earth, Strange stood at the boundary of what used to be the dimensional gateway. The cracks had sealed. The pressure had normalized. Reality had survived its stress test, but the scars remained. He could see them if he looked at the right angle. Thin lines in space-time where something had pushed hard enough to leave permanent marks.
It held.
Wong stood beside him, equally drained.
This time.
They looked at each other. Two sorcerers who just learned that protecting reality sometimes meant opening doors to things that could destroy it. Trusting that when those things left, they'd leave the world intact. It was a terrible lesson to learn. But they'd learned it anyway. Around them, the Avengers began the slow work of standing up from their own wreckage, helping the wounded, counting the living, mourning the dead. The war was over. The cost would last forever. And somewhere walking through dimensions that didn't belong to this universe, a monkey king with a staff and too much freedom traveled alone, leaving behind a world that had proven itself worth exactly what someone had been willing to die for. No more, no less. The ash continued to fall. Eventually it would settle. Eventually it would be swept away or buried under new construction. But for now, it covered everything evenly. Reminder and memorial. Proof that victory and loss could wear the same face. And Earth kept turning heavier than before, but still turning. Still here,
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching and we will see you next time.